Welcome to one more edition of Politics Done Right. I'm Egberto Willis, your host. Thank you so kindly for being a part of our show. Today, we are honored to have the one and only Brad Wolf. He's the executive director and co-founder of Peace Action Network of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, a former lawyer, prosecutor, professor, and community college dean. He writes for various publications. And in fact, that is how I found him. Hello, Brad. How are you doing today?
I am doing well. How are you doing?
I am doing great. Let me tell you, first of all, I am so happy that I found your article on Common Dreams today, titled The Powell Memo Revisited. Actually, I've written a whole lot on the Powell Memo before, and I am just surprised that enough people have not seen that this memo, we used to call it the Powell Manifesto earlier on, was not the pathway to our current state. But anyhow, why did you write this article?
You know, I had read that the memo years ago, and it always bothered me. It really started to wear on me, just the idea that there was this democratic spirit that was happening in the 1960s where Americans were really taking their constitutional rights seriously and pressing the issue on big business, on government, on a lot of issues. So they were able to end segregation in the South. They were able to end an unjust war in Southeast Asia. They were able to start the environmental movement. They were able to assert consumer rights. And it seemed like just as they were beginning to understand and recognize the power that they had, something came in and stole it. And the power was reverted to this small oligarchy of people. And as I started recently working on this other project called the War Crimes Tribunal, it started to occur to me that there was a common thread among much of the suffering that goes on in the world, whether it be people concerned with the environment or housing insecurity, food insecurity, racism, international justice, peace. All these things were tied somehow together. And it really did come down to this corporate capture of America that occurred in the last 40 to 50 years. And so that's what got me to write the article finally, and was able to take some time, put it, pen to paper, get it out there.
What I love about your article is, like I said, I've read the entire manifesto, the Powell Memo, many times. And, it's kind of long, wieldy, etc. And what you did in just a few pages or a couple of pages or whatever is isolated all the damage that it has done and the infiltration that it took. And, what I loved about the way you wrote about it is that it's something that anybody could understand. So why don't you give us the bullet points of this great memo written by, interestingly, a Democrat appointed to the Supreme Court by a Republican?
That's correct. So Lewis Powell was a corporate attorney, very powerful corporate attorney, and was turned down his first opportunity to be on the Supreme Court. Richard Nixon asked him in 1969 to be on the Supreme Court. He said no because he was making too much money as a corporate lawyer and didn't want to go sit on the high court, but eventually agreed to do that. And representing big tobacco and all of these other corporations, he thought that Americans were beginning to take their constitutional rights a little too seriously, and that this was a threat to big business. And so he decided to write down all of his concerns and send this off to the then director of the United States Chamber of Commerce, who was a close friend of his. And so he listed point by point where he saw all these, quote, attacks coming from. He referred to it as a chorus of criticism. And, to me, a chorus of criticism may cause some sleepless nights or make you a little uncomfortable, but it's not an attempt to bring down the entire free enterprise in America. What Americans were doing were asserting their rights to have governmental oversight on the commodities that they purchase every day, whether they be automobiles, the food that they eat, things of that nature. But business clearly does not like that. And so Powell pointed out, how do we retake power in America, pull it back from the hands of all these other Americans and put it back in our hands, in corporate America's hands? And so he said, academia, first and foremost, is an area where we have to be much more assertive because there are too many, quote, leftist professors working in academia who are poisoning the minds of young people, teaching them to question business, question government, question other establishmentarian entities. So his idea was we need to seed academia with our professors, conservative professors who are pro-business. And we need to start building a speakers bureau of pro-business speakers who will go out to these campuses and speak on campus. We need to hire marketing firms to do a much better job marketing a favorable light in our business. At the college campuses, he pointed out, business puts a lot of money into colleges through research grants. They endow buildings, they endow faculty chairs. He said, let's use that influence to have them turn the narrative away from us and put us in a favorable light. So academia was very big, but he was really concerned about artists, musicians, sort of celebrity people like Ralph Nader, who had gained great notoriety in the 60s as a consumer rights advocate. And he said, we need to have very attractive, and he kept using the word attractive, people and articulate people out there arguing our cause and make us appear just as attractive to the rest of Americans as what he referred to as the left, what I refer to as just basic democracy, but he characterized it as leftist or communist. He wanted to have a whole army of people going out and promoting that narrative. So it was work the courts, work the politicians, work academia, work television, and then work the news media, which he said obviously is owned by corporations. Let's remind these corporations that their profits are at stake and they better stop running stories on environmental rights, consumer rights, everything else. Let's, put some stories in there that are pro-business. And lo and behold, it all worked, slowly, methodically. They were very effective at doing this. They were patient, they were prescient, and they got the job done to the detriment of all Americans, because we all suffer from that now, whether we're dealing with income inequality or, refugee problems or peace in the world, homelessness, all the other issues I mentioned. You can kind of point the finger back to this memo as what happened.
What's interesting, Brad, is that whenever you hear, we are independent media right here. Okay. Whenever you hear something like the media, you have to beware in the way you listen to news on the media, because it can only go so far. If you hear about a bad drug, it can only go that far. If you hear about Tesla having issues, it can only go that far because they advertise your batteries on network TV, on cable TV. And you try to make that analogy, and people then think you're paranoid. What concerns me is we have the written template that's been followed. And one would think that there would be more organizations out there. And I think that is one of the reasons when I read your article on Common Dreams, because yes, a lot of folks hear Powell Memo, but it's not hammered into our psyche the way the things that he wanted hammered into our psyche, trans, all these other things are hammered into people's psyche today. So there's one thing that I saw in your article, and I said, I wonder how come you didn't mention this, and that was Cato Institute and Heritage Foundation. Let's expand on that relative to the Powell Memo.
Very big, very influential conservative think tanks that he said we need to have think tanks of that kind. They were, lo and behold, funded by corporations. And those think tanks put out white papers, policy papers that people in government then use and implement. It was the Heritage Foundation that gave Donald Trump the list of Supreme Court names to use if he were to be elected president. So these conservative think tanks have enormous influence. The Council on Foreign Policy Relations is another big one. These are not government. It almost sounds as if they're governmental institutions. They are not. They are privately funded organizations with a particular agenda, and the agenda is to get this neoliberal word out there. And the Powell Manifesto was really the call for neoliberalism as we see it today, which is, lower corporate taxes, deregulation, minimize the rights of consumers, and have escalatory war across the globe in order to keep business going.
And it's interesting because when you speak about Americans, what happened in the 60s, you are kind. I normally say that as we as a society became more intelligent, we asked the question, why is it that we work so hard for so little to afford some to make so much on our backs? And that is I have always thought that was the ultimate fear of our plutocracy or oligarchy, in that people would start asking that question, wait a minute, the intellect come from us. We have this fallacy that we believe that somehow innovation is somehow equated to, let's say, capitalism, or that somehow innovation only occurs in that society. I'm an engineer by trade, and nobody had to pay me to think about designing new things. That's what happens with people who are infatuated with the particular discipline that they want. And the people on top, in my humble opinion, are the ones that don't innovate, but learn how to do it on the backs of others. Your thoughts on that?
I would agree completely. They are people that replicate. They don't innovate. They take ideas that other people have, and they simply replicate them. They market them better, and then they do it on the backs of workers. You only need to look around at the oligarchs that we have today and the income inequality, and you can see the difference in the CEO salaries and the salary of the average worker. It used to be much closer, but now it's gotten to ridiculous proportions. We're back in a gilded age. And again, this is not by accident. This is by design. This is what conservatives want. This is what business wants. And conservative corporations pay a lot of money to get this. As I pointed out in the article, weapons manufacturers, they have received over $281 million in the last 20 years. That's over $250 million just in their campaign war chest. Now, an additional $1.5 billion was spent in lobbying efforts for these candidates that they selected in order to promote their agenda. So a lot of money is spent in that to be sure that the average American doesn't get a whole lot. And the attempt is keep us diverted with a lot of cultural wars, keep us arguing and pitted against ourselves. So we're consumed with things that, anything that prevent us from looking at what they're doing. So they eat at the banquet table. Everybody else gets the crumbs. And if they can keep us worried and scared and angry enough at each other, they're very happy. That's their goal.
They have very good psychologists working for them because they know exactly how to reach our carnality. They know exactly how to meet our fears, etc. My question, well, I'll ask this at the end of the interview because I want to go into another subject that's a passion for you, and that is the tribunals that you guys are, that several of you have put together. But before we go into there and closing the subject on the Powell Memo, how first of all, you did a great job. Let me just say on Common Dreams. I think it's an important article. I think what we have to do is get articles like these exploded on the internet, and well-written articles that make it not from the high skies, but something that people can understand. Right. How else, or how can we make sure that this message gets out there in the places that it needs to get out there?
I think sharing it with friends and family and everybody at your workplace is a great way to go, and sharing it on social media. But I think it needs to be taken directly to elected officials. I think it needs to go before, regardless of who your official is. I live in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Our congressman here is a very conservative Republican. I would still very much like to sit down with him, show him this memo, which he's probably never heard of, and let him know this has occurred on the backs of the American people, your constituents. This has done great damage to the vast majority of the constituents in your congressional district. And, you need to be aware of this, and you need to make changes. So I do think people can organize around a memo like the Powell Memo because it's right there before them. And I think it's a great organizing opportunity for people to look at. You're always looking for, where's the smoking gun? Well, here's the smoking gun. It's right in front of you. Here's the plan that they followed. It's almost as if, you discovered their blueprints for war against Americans, against our democracy. And their fear of too much democracy going on in this country is written all over the Powell Memo.
Interestingly, and this is sort of an offside, but I don't think from our inception, we were not created to be a pure democracy. In fact, having 2 senators per state, in fact, having an electoral college, in fact, having even a Supreme Court. People talk about the 3 legs of the government, co-equal branches of government. There's no way one can consider 9 people on a Supreme Court a co-equal branch. to those elected by the people. So the narrative doesn't match the reality. And I think more Americans, instead of feeling the singing the glory, glory, hallelujah, need to talk about the one great thing that was made within that Constitution was its ability to evolve. And for us to create that evolving in the Constitution is something that we need. Well, the last question I always ask is, what would you have liked me to ask you that I didn't?
Oh, interesting. Well, I think if we could get back to the Powell Memo, the typical question would be, how do we reverse it, right? How do we get out from under this? Because it does seem the corporate monoliths do seem overwhelming. And I always try to remind folks that the government and the corporations only have the amount of power that we cede to them, right? We agree to give them a certain amount of power. And if we withdraw that approval, they cannot function. So we need to remind ourselves that we, the masses, have all of the power here, and they are terrified of us realizing that. So as we get out and understand, and you read the works of, say, Gene Sharp and nonviolence and the wonderful techniques of nonviolence, you'll come to understand just how much power the masses do have, and we're not impotent. We are extremely potent. And I think the 1960s was just a hint of how successful we can be when we set our minds to it. So I would encourage people, energize people, give them hope. This can be done. And I hope to see it done in my lifetime. I hope to see a really dramatic change in this country and in the world for the better, because I believe it can be done.
Brad Wolf, Executive Director and co-founder of Peace Action Network of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, a lawyer, prosecutor, professor in community college, dean. He writes for various publications. Thank you so kindly for having been on Politics Done Right.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it. Appreciate the show and all the work you do.
Thank you. We spend a lot of time deconstructing the news, trying to parse it into a form that everybody can understand. We try to find those little nitpicks where it flies above the fray, etc. If you really like these videos that we do, I want to ask a big favor. Please go ahead. Number one, subscribe to our channel. And number two, please join if you can. Thank you so kindly for watching. Keep watching. Please remember to share. We must populate the entire internet with our progressive message, a message that we know is what most Americans say that they want. So help us, please join.